The rifle in Beckett Doyle's hands did not waver, though the man on the other end of it wore a badge he had bought and a smile that had buried better people than either of them. Josephine Hale stood at his back, with her wrists still raw from the rope she had worked loose in the dark. She watched the only man who had ever put himself between her and a hanging refuse to step aside. Above the yard, the Arizona sky hung the color of a fresh bruise. "She belongs to 2 states and a rope, Doyle," Emmett Boone said, easing his horse forward one slow pace and tasting the moment. Beckett thumbed the hammer back, and the click carried farther than any shout. Behind him, Josephine felt her heart slam once, because no living soul had ever chosen her over his own skin. No one had ever stood in front of her before. 3 weeks earlier, Beckett had wanted nothing from a woman but a signature on a marriage line, a name beside his in the county book, proof enough to satisfy the bank that had his father's land by the throat. He had been cheated once by a partner who smiled the same easy way Boone smiled now, and he had promised himself he would never again hand his trust to a stranger. Then the coach had come down from the pass, with Josephine on it, and something in her held-together stillness had reached past the promise. She expected to be used, and then discarded. He expected to be robbed. Neither of them had planned on the thing that was rising in the space between them. The poster was already nailed to the mercantile wall in town, her face inked crude, and her crime printed bold, and by nightfall every rider in the territory would know. Boone knew, the dead man's powerful kin knew, and they had money enough to buy the whole county's fear. Beckett had 1 loaded rifle, a mortgage due in 19 days, and a wife he had known for less than a month. "Then you'll have to come through me," Beckett said, and he did not blink. Josephine's hand found the back of his coat and held there, and for the first time since the killing, she let herself hope that the truth might be enough. Boone smiled wider. The clock on all of it had already started to run. To understand why Beckett Doyle would raise a rifle for a woman the law called a murderer, a person has to go back to the ground he stood on. The Doyle ranch sat in a bend of the Verde Valley, where his father had broken his body against rock and drought for 30 years, and then died, still owing money to men who had never lifted a shovel. Beckett buried him in the spring and read the loan papers that same night by a single lamp. The bank would forgive the debt and honor the old inheritance clause only if the son married and settled the land, proving the Doyle name meant to stay. A bachelor was a risk. A husband was a fixture. He had loved once, or believed he had, back when a smooth-talking cattle partner named Harlan took half a season's earnings and Beckett's faith in the same wagon out of town. Harlan had shaken his hand on a Sunday and been across the territory line by Wednesday, and the whole valley had called Harlan honest right up until the day the money was gone. After that, Beckett trusted the fence line and the weather and almost nothing that spoke. So when he wrote the advertisement for a wife, he wrote it plain and cold, expecting whoever answered to want his roof and his money and to give nothing true in return. He told himself that was fine. A cold bargain could not betray a man who had already decided not to feel anything at all. Josephine Hale answered from a boarding house 2 territories east, and she answered because she was running. Months before, in a fine house in Kansas where she had worked as a governess to a banker's grown ward, a man named Cyrus Vane had come to her door after midnight with liquor on his breath and certainty in his hands. Cyrus was the nephew of a railroad man whose name opened every courtroom in the state. When he forced his way in, Josephine reached for the fire iron because it was the only honest thing within reach, and she swung it because he would not stop. He fell and did not rise. By dawn, the family had a different story ready, and their story had lawyers. They did not call it a woman defending her life. They called it murder, and they papered 2 states with her face, because a lie travels faster when it is paid for. The law had decided she was guilty before she opened her mouth, and after that, no door stayed open and no man was safe to tell. She learned to trust the road and her own 2 feet, and nothing that wore a badge or a promise. So she answered a cold advertisement from a cold rancher, believing a marriage of convenience in a far territory might hide her long enough to breathe. She expected Beckett to want a servant and a signature. He expected her to want his land. Neither of them wrote the truth in those letters, and yet the letters carried something the truth would later confirm. She noticed he never lied to flatter her. He noticed she never once asked how much the ranch was worth. Two people braced for betrayal had each, by accident, found the one stranger who was not there to take. Josephine boarded the coach in a borrowed coat with a false name sewn into the lining and her real name burning under it. Beckett saddled up to meet a woman he had already decided not to need. The poster with her face was riding the same roads she was, only faster. The coach came down through the pass at dusk, and Beckett Doyle waited beside his wagon, with his hat low and his expectations lower. When the door opened, the woman who stepped down did not gush or simper or reach for his arm. Josephine set her own boot on the step, carried her own single bag, and met his eyes with a steadiness that unsettled him more than any charm could have. She looked like a person counting exits. "You'll be Doyle," she said, not a question, and she did not offer her hand. He took the bag from her because his mother had raised him to, and their fingers did not touch. "I keep my word," she added, low, as if the sentence cost her something. Beckett studied the tight line of her shoulders and found, to his own irritation, that he believed her. They were married the next morning by a circuit preacher who had somewhere better to be, in a church that smelled of dust and old candle wax. The vows were short. When the preacher said the part about honor and keep, Josephine's voice caught, just slightly, on the word protect, and Beckett heard it and said nothing. He signed the county book. She signed beneath him in a careful hand, and for one breath her pen hovered before she wrote a name he did not yet know was borrowed. The bank clerk in town stamped the marriage certificate and told Beckett the clause was satisfied so long as the union held through the season's audit. 19 days had become the length of a marriage neither of them knew how to be inside of. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was not unfriendly. When a wheel dropped into a rut and pitched her sideways, his arm came up on its own to steady her, and she flinched hard, then went still, then quietly said thank you, as if the words were foreign in her mouth. That first week they learned each other the way wary animals do, by proximity and small tests. She rose before him and had the coffee made and the hens fed, not to please him, but because idle hands frightened her. He noticed she never sat with her back to a door. She noticed he fixed things before they broke and spoke to his horses more gently than to people. When a storm tore part of the barn roof loose, they worked it together in the rain, without a word wasted, her handing him nails, him bracing the beam, the two of them moving like they had done it for years. He should have felt cheated. He kept waiting to feel cheated. Instead, he found himself watching the doorway for her, and hating that he watched. One evening she caught him at it, and her chin came up, defensive. "Whatever you're waiting to catch me at," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "you'll be waiting a long time." Beckett set down the harness he had been oiling and looked at her full on. "I've been cheated by people who smiled the whole while," he answered. "You don't smile. It's about the only thing that makes me trust you." Something flickered across her face, part fear and part want, and she turned back to the stove before he could name it. That night Josephine lay awake in the small room he had given her, listening to the house settle, and let herself feel the danger of the place. Not the danger of the man down the hall, which had stopped feeling like danger somewhere between the storm and the coffee. The danger was worse. She was beginning to want to stay, and wanting anything was how people like her got caught. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, folded inside a bundle of freight, when a drummer passing through town unrolled a stack of wanted bills across the mercantile counter, and one of them wore Josephine's face. The storekeeper, a nervous man named Pettit, who owed money everywhere, looked from the ink to the new Doyle wife he had sold flour to only that morning, and his hands began to shake. By afternoon the whisper had legs. By evening it had reached the saloon, and the saloon had reached everyone. Beckett heard it from his nearest neighbor, an old rancher named Saul Avery, who rode out at supper to say it to his face, because that was the decent thing. "They're saying your bride killed 2 men back east," Saul said from the saddle. not dismounting. "They're saying there's a bounty. I'm not one to judge a poster, Beckett, but a lot of folks are, and some of them carry guns for pay." He touched his hat to Josephine, who had come to the doorway, with her heart in her throat, and he rode off into the dark. Beckett came inside and shut the door, and stood with his back to it. Josephine did not run, though every muscle in her wanted to. She had promised herself that when this moment came, she would meet it standing. "It's true that there's a poster," she said. "It's not true the way they wrote it." Her voice did not break, but her hands did, twisting the cloth of her skirt until the knuckles went white. He crossed the room slowly and did the thing she least expected. He pulled out a chair, turned it to face her, and sat down. "Then tell me the way it's true," Beckett said. "All of it, and look at me while you do." So she told him. She told him about the house in Kansas and the midnight at her door, about Cyrus Vane and the fire iron, and the weight of a man falling, about waking the next morning, already convicted by people who had never asked her a single question. She told it plainly, without softening, and she watched his face the whole time, waiting for the shutter to come down. It did not come down. Somewhere in the middle, his jaw had set hard, not against her, but against the men who had done it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "They never let you speak," he said finally. It was not a question. "No," she answered. "A woman like me doesn't get spoken to. She gets papered." Beckett looked at the floor a long moment, and when he raised his head, there was something dangerous and settled in his eyes. "I was cheated by a man everyone in this valley called honest," he said. "I learned the hard way that a printed word and the truth aren't kin. I'm not handing you to men who never asked." Josephine's composure, which had survived 2 states and 1,000 miles, finally cracked, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth so the sob would not get all the way out. He did not reach for her. He gave her the dignity of putting herself back together on her own, and that restraint told her more about him than any embrace could have. Later, when the lamp was low, she asked the question she was most afraid of. "The bank needs this marriage to hold. If they know what I am, you lose the ranch. Why haven't you put me on a coach?" Beckett was quiet for a while. "Because the ranch is dirt and cattle," he said at last. "And you're the first honest thing that's walked onto it in years. I mean to keep the honest thing." Emmett Boone rode into the valley the following week with a fresh horse, a folded poster, and the patience of a man who was never in a hurry because he had never once failed. He was not a lawman, though he wore a star he had been given by a sheriff on the Vane payroll, and he did his killing legal when he could and quiet when he could not. The Vane family wanted Josephine Hale brought back for a trial whose ending was already written. They wanted the embarrassment of her closed like a door. Boone took a room in town and began buying drinks, and Fear did the rest of his work for free. Pettit told him where the Doyle ranch sat, then spent the night ashamed, and told no one he had done it. 2 saddle tramps signed on for a share of the bounty and started sleeping in the livery with their rifles across their knees. Within days, the whole county understood that the frightened new wife out at the Doyle place had a price on her, and prices have a way of turning neighbors into strangers, and strangers into a mob. Doors that had opened to Beckett his whole life stayed shut when he passed. Saul Avery was one of the few who did not turn, but one decent old man on one tired horse could not hold back a tide. Beckett felt the noose tightening and did not wait to be hanged by it. He rode to town and stood in the middle of the street and let Boone come to him. "You've no warrant that means anything here," Beckett said. That star was bought. Boone smiled his gentle smile and did not deny it. "Paper's paper, Doyle. Yours says married. Mine says wanted. Mine's worth more." He leaned in. "You could still walk clear of this. Hand her over and keep your dirt." "Come onto my land uninvited," Beckett answered, "and I'll treat you like any other predator." He rode home with his back straight and his hands cold on the reins, knowing he had just chosen a woman over the only inheritance his father had left him. That night, he told Josephine plainly what waited in town, and he expected her to want to run, because running was all the world had ever taught her. Instead, she stood at the window a long time, then turned with a hard new light in her face. "I'm done running," she said. "They papered a lie because nobody made them answer for the truth. So we make them answer." Beckett looked at her, and something in his chest that had been clenched for years came loose. They began to build a case the way she had once built a life, out of scraps and stubbornness. Josephine had kept letters, ones from a maid in the Vane house named Alma, who had seen Cyrus drunk and violent before, who had been paid to keep silent, and had kept one letter back for spite. There had been a doctor, too, who examined the body and had written in his own hand that the wound came from a defensive blow before the family bought the report and buried it. Names surfaced. A path appeared, thin and dangerous, back toward the truth. "If we can reach the doctor and reach Alma," Josephine said, spreading the letters on the table, "there's proof. Not for men who already decided, for a judge who hasn't been paid yet." Beckett covered her hand with his without thinking, and this time she did not flinch. She turned her palm up under his and held on. Outside, far off, a rider paused on the ridge to watch the lamplight, then turned back toward town to report that the Doyle wife had not fled. The clock on the ranch had 11 days left. The clock on Boone's patients had fewer. Proving a thing costs, and the bill came due fast. Beckett wired a lawyer in Prescott he had known before the trouble, a plain, honest man named Ezra Cobb, and Cobb agreed to carry a petition to a territorial judge if the evidence could be brought in the flesh. That meant reaching the Kansas doctor and the maid Alma, and reaching them before the Vane money did. It meant travel and telegrams and greased palms, and every dollar Beckett had was already promised to the bank. He sold the North herd, 40 head, the cattle that were meant to make the mortgage, driven to the railhead and sold at a loss because a quick sale is always a poor one. When Josephine understood what he had done, she went white. "That was the ranch," she said. "That was your father's land. You've spent it on me." Beckett loaded the last of the money into a strongbox and closed the lid. "Land keeps," he said. "There'll be other herds and other seasons. There's only one of you." She had no answer for that. She had spent her whole life being told her life was worth less than someone's convenience, and here was a man who had just proven the opposite with everything he owned. They rode to the railhead together to send the money and the letters east with a bonded courier, and on the platform, in the noise and steam, Boone found them. He had 2 men with him and the false star on his chest, and he meant to take her right there in the open, where the crowd would freeze. "Josephine Hale," he called, loud, so the name would do its poison. "You're wanted for murder." The platform went still. A dozen strangers turned to look at her like she was already dead. Beckett stepped in front of her. He did not draw. He simply put his body between her and the guns and spoke so the whole platform could hear. "This woman is my wife, and she was attacked in her own room by a rich man's nephew, and she defended her life the way any of you would. The proof is riding east tonight. You want to shoot her down in front of witnesses before a judge has even read it? Then you'd best be sure of your paper." Doubt rippled through the crowd. Boone's men glanced at each other, because a legal killing needs an audience that believes, and this one had begun to waver. Boone's smile thinned for the first time. "You're a fool for her," he said quietly, so only Beckett could hear. "I am," Beckett said back, just as quiet, and did not move. That was the one and only time Josephine ever heard him claim the word out loud. She had spent months braced for the moment a man would trade her for his own safety, and instead she watched a man plant himself in front of leveled guns and dare the world to come through him. The courier's train pulled out with their proof aboard. Boone, unwilling to murder a woman in front of 100 witnesses who now had questions, backed down for the day, promising with his eyes that the day was not over. Beckett walked her back to the wagon with his arm around her shoulders, and this time she leaned in. On the ride home, she finally said the thing she had been holding since Kansas. "I trusted a house once, and it convicted me. I don't know how to trust a person." Beckett kept his eyes on the road. "You don't have to know how," he said. "You just have to notice you already do." The proof reached the judge in Prescott the same week Boone reached the end of his patience, and the 2 facts collided on the Doyle ranch under a hard white moon. Ezra Cobb wired that Judge Harmon had read the doctor's honest report and Alma's sworn letter and had issued an order staying any arrest, a rider carrying the paper north at first light. But first light was hours off, and Boone did not intend to wait for it. He came at night with his 2 men and a torch, meaning to take Josephine dead or living before any judge's ink could dry. Beckett had been ready for a week. He knew the ground, and they did not. When the first tramp came over the corral fence, Beckett was already there, and the fight was short and brutal and quiet. He put the man down with a rifle stock and turned for the second, who fired wild and hit the barn wall a foot from Josephine's head. She did not scream. She picked up the fallen man's pistol with steady hands and covered the dark, because she was done being a thing that only got hunted. Boone came last, the way patient men do, walking his horse into the yard as if he owned it. "Give her to me, and this ends," he called. "One woman for your whole life." "That's a bargain, and you know it." Beckett stepped out where the moon could find him, rifle down but ready. "There's a stay order riding up from Prescott," he answered. "A judge has read the truth. You take her now, and it's plain murder. And this time, there's paper that says so." For a moment, the yard held nothing but the wind. Then Boone did the thing his kind always does when the profit turns to loss. He drew. He was fast, faster than most, but he was aiming for Josephine, and that half-second of malice cost him. Beckett's rifle came up and spoke once. Boone's shot went into the dirt as he fell, the false star catching the moonlight on his way down, and then the yard was silent again, except for the ringing in their ears. The last tramp threw down his gun and ran for his horse and was gone into the dark, wanting no part of a fight that had just gone legal. Josephine crossed the yard to Beckett and put both hands flat against his chest, feeling his heart go like a hammer under her palms. "You're not hit," she said, half question, half prayer. "I'm not," he said, and only then did his hands start to shake. She took them in hers and held them still. "I killed a man once, and the world called me a monster for it," she whispered. "You just killed a man for me, and all I feel is safe. What does that make me?" Beckett bent his forehead to hers. "Free," he said. "It makes you free." At dawn, the rider from Prescott came up the road with the judge's order and a deputy who was ashamed of the whole business, and the poster that had hunted Josephine across 2 states became so much waste paper. The doctor's report, Alma's letter, and Boone's midnight attack together told a story no bought court could bury. Word went east that the Vane family's frame had come apart in an Arizona yard, and a railroad man's name, so useful for opening courtroom doors, began quietly closing them instead. Josephine Hale was not a fugitive anymore. She was a wife on her own land in the morning light, and she was believed. The judge's order cleared Josephine's name in the territory within the month, and Ezra Cobb carried the fight back east until Kansas itself struck the charge and named Cyrus Vane's death what it had always been, a woman defending her life. The powerful kin, exposed and shamed, learned that bought silence only holds until one honest doctor and one brave maid decide they have carried a lie long enough. Alma came west that autumn and stayed on at the ranch, and she and Josephine became the kind of friends that only 2 survivors can be. The ranch had been sold out from under them to save her, and the mortgage still came due. Beckett went to the bank expecting to lose the land after all, and found the county had shifted beneath him. Saul Avery had gathered the neighbors, the same ones who once looked at a poster and saw a stranger, and they had seen instead a man who spent everything he owned on the truth. They lent him the herd back on a handshake. The bank, watching which way the valley leaned, extended the note. The Doyle land stayed Doyle land. They were married a second time that spring, in front of every neighbor who had turned and everyone who had not, and this time no one had somewhere better to be. Josephine wore a dress the color of the valley in June, and when the preacher reached the part about honor and keep, her voice did not catch on the word protect. She had already learned what it meant, spoken and lived. Beckett looked at her across the small church and understood that the coldest bargain he had ever struck had handed him the one warm thing he could not have bought. Two people who had each decided never to trust again had proven each other wrong, on purpose, at cost, and had earned every inch of what they now had. Late that night on the porch, wrapped in one blanket against the high desert cold, Josephine finally said the words she had carried 1,000 miles. "You believed me, when the whole world had already decided," she said. "Do you know what that is? To be believed?" Beckett pulled her closer and looked out at the land they had almost lost and kept. "It's the only thing worth staking a ranch on," he said. "There is a line worth carrying out of everything the two of them lived through that year." As Susan B. Anthony said, cautious, careful people, always casting about to preserve their reputation, can never bring about a reform. Beckett Doyle was not cautious with his heart or his land, and Josephine Hale stopped being careful with her truth, and between them they broke a bought lie that careful people would have left standing forever. The reform was a small one, only 2 lives set right, and 1 patch of hard Arizona ground held onto against the odds, but it was real, and it was earned, and no ledger in any bank could measure what it had cost them, or what it was worth. So here is the question for you. If the whole world had already decided you were guilty, would you want a man brave enough to plant himself in front of you, or would you settle for a man clever enough to stay clear? Tell me in the comments, because your answer says everything about the love you believe you deserve. And when you are ready for the next one, it is waiting for you right now.